You know, people today will often talk about communism like it's some big spooky thing. What are they talking about specifically? Well, mostly the big spooky things associated with communism.
Democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in.
That pretty much sums it up, and in no place is that more evident than Cold War Germany. From 1949, when Germany was split into the Democratic West and the Soviet East, the difference in quality of life between the two countries was stark. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the historically free-thinking, free-living city of Berlin. So many people fled to the West that the communist government in the East, facing a population crunch and massive brain drain, instituted lethal border controls. But it wasn't enough. So on August 13, 1961, Berliners woke up to find a physical wall dividing them from their neighbors in the other Germany. The Berlin Wall stood for 28 years, during which time escapes over, through, and around it became the stuff of legend. To try it was nothing less than to take your life in your own hands. These German border guards shot to kill. By the time the wall fell in 1989, at least 140 people died trying to escape. But that's just the official number. A lot of governments prefer to keep their atrocities on the down low, so other deaths recorded around the wall are data points to be treated with suspicion. Add the people who died crossing the border at official checkpoints, those who were killed trying to cross the border outside Berlin, and those who drowned in the Baltic Sea trying to swim around the fortifications, and the total dead at the East German border is estimated at 650, according to the Berlin Wall Foundation. If you believe science is a matter of objective truth, then you might not have made it as a Soviet scientist. In the early Soviet state, political clout could easily trump actual scientific knowledge and ability. And nowhere is this more glaringly obvious than in the career of Trofim Denisovich Lysenko. Lysenko was an unimpressive scientist, but he was from a poor Ukrainian family. This made him exactly the kind of anti-elite Stalin wanted to help establish absolute Soviet power. Lysenkoism now means government misuse of science with a political goal, but in 1948 it referred to a new model of genetics Lysenko was instrumental in developing. He thought the concept of genetics was bourgeois pseudoscience. Stalin was all about eliminating the aristocracy, so he was obviously thrilled with that idea. Lysenkoism quickly became the official Soviet line on biological inheritance. What that means in English is that natural selection was out the window, and by applying good old socialism to plants, they'd all grow happily and yield substantial crops. To put it bluntly, Lysenko's ideas didn't work. And in terms of consequences, among others, the Chinese adoption of Lysenkoist ideas of plant biology contributed to the devastating famine of 1959 to 1961. Turns out that plants are terrible communists. Scientifically dubious views on plant biology may have been enough to create a famine, but there are other ways out there to make people go hungry. Add to the mix some authoritarian decisions about who deserves to eat what and when, and you've got some of the worst starvation crises of the 20th century. The Holodomor, a devastating famine in the ordinarily fertile Ukraine in 1932 to 1933, was a Stalinist project meant to starve independence-minded Ukrainians into submission. And while the Ukrainian spirit survived, some 4 million Ukrainians died when food supplies were confiscated and villages that allegedly failed to meet grain production quotas were blockaded. If you're wondering why nobody did anything to help out the Ukrainians, Walter Duranty reported that there was no famine, and it was all anti-Soviet propaganda. He won a Pulitzer for his reporting, and it was all lies. In China, the regime tried to jumpstart industrialization with domestic iron production, yanking farmers away from their fields. This led to the Great Chinese Famine, which killed at least 15 million people from 1959 to 1961, though estimates range as high as 50 million. An Ethiopian attempt to replicate Stalin's successes by forcing people to move into collective villages disrupted food production and killed over 400,000 in the mid-1980s. So if you've ever wondered why We Are the World happened, that'd be communism. And then there's North Korea, which was hit by a perfect storm of governmental mismanagement, so-called natural disaster, and land exhaustion in the mid-1990s. You'll never guess what North Korea blamed for their agricultural woes. Good old Mother Nature.
I would not emphasize natural disasters. The same disasters hit South Korea and had very little impact.
That's a sound analysis. Here's the short version. You know what step farming or terrace farming is? That's when you turn a mountain into a farming area. When North Korea did this, they ended up destroying their actual farmland, depriving it of nutrients. In another classic from the Communist Governance Manual, aid meant for starving citizens was diverted for military use. 1 to 2 million North Koreans died, with an epidemic of malnutrition lasting for several years after the official end of the famine in 1998. In 1975, Communist Khmer Rouge forces and an oddball alliance with the deposed king captured the capital of Cambodia. If you're not familiar with what happened during the Cambodian Civil War, the Khmer Rouge were the communist side. Rouge is French for red, like Red China. But this regime got its red reputation for other reasons too. At the time, few predicted how brutal the new government would be. Until it was deposed in 1979, the Khmer Rouge presided over a bloody reorganization of society now widely recognized as a genocide. The violence claimed between 1.5 and 3 million lives. The chaos makes any statistics hard to trust, but for perspective, the population in 1970 was probably just over 7 million. So yeah, they wiped out nearly half the population. Pol Pot, the new Cambodian dictator, presided over the forced relocation of town and city dwellers into the countryside to work as farmers. Despite having no experience and limited equipment, families were split up and assigned to forced labor brigades. The Khmer Rouge distrusted intellectuals, which to them meant almost anyone who had a profession. This prejudice was so extreme that even just wearing glasses could make someone a target of violence. Ethnic groups were also in the crosshairs. Chinese and Vietnamese populations were decimated, and some 70% of the Muslim Cham minority died at the regime's hands. Those deemed unworthy of life by the regime were taken to rural killing fields to be slaughtered after digging their own shallow graves. In 1966, Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu had what he apparently thought was a great idea. In order to increase Romania's population and create more good socialist workers, his government issued Decree 770, which banned abortion and contraception. This last point was academic. Contraception wasn't widely available, but abortion was, and Romanian women used it to limit their family sizes to what they could manage in far from thriving socialist Romania. But Ceausescu didn't care what Romanian women wanted or could handle, and Decree 770 lasted until 1989, when Ceausescu became the only European communist dictator to be tried and executed for his actions in office. In 1967, right after Decree 770 was implemented, there was a Romanian baby boom, after which the birth rate began to tumble. At the same time, maternal mortality shot up, including women who died from unregulated abortions. According to Human Rights Watch, 10,000 women and girls died from such procedures. Compounding the crisis, children born to families who couldn't support them filled orphanages, which became notorious for their poor conditions, abusive staff, and high death rates, especially in those for disabled children. The Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, or the Cultural Revolution for short, was a decade of bloody chaos in China resulting from Mao Zedong's plan to weaponize the Chinese public against domestic enemies. In 1966, Mao sent urban youth into the countryside to be re-educated by peasants, then returned them to the cities in units known as Red Guards. Remember that red as in Khmer Rouge from earlier? It was like that here, too. They were a poorly controlled paramilitary organization empowered to persecute anyone who wasn't sufficiently revolutionary enough, which was everybody to them. They were big on eliminating the four olds: old ideas, old customs, old habits, and old culture. The fact that the 72-year-old Mao was a bit of an old himself wasn't brought up for some reason.
Chairman Mao said it's during class warfare that those destined to continue the proletariat's revolutionary struggle will appear.
In 1968, the violence continued, with victims chosen for crimes as trivial as bourgeois haircuts. People denounced as anti-revolutionary were tortured by the Red Guards, and the army was responsible for as many as 2 million deaths in the name of Chairman Mao. After the Bolsheviks took power in Russia in late 1917, Trotsky and Lenin cemented control in part by creating a new kind of enemy: the class traitor. This extremely flexible and therefore extremely useful label could be applied to anyone the government wanted to suppress. Many of these dissidents were sent to gulags. Gulag is an acronym for the Russian for Main Camp Administration, a division of the Ministry of the Interior that ran the labor camps, most of which were in Siberia or far northern Russia. These camps were later combined with common prisons in order to streamline operations and provide more forced labor for projects like mining or infrastructure development. The Soviet economy came to rely on slave labor from the gulags, which provided an obvious incentive to imprison more people. Some 20 million people ended up in gulags, and it's estimated that between 1.6 and 15 million may have died from the harsh conditions, overwork, abuse, and brutal cold. The former gulag system was abolished in 1957, at which point the growing Soviet economy no longer needed quite so many slaves. But the modern Russian state continues to sentence people to penal colonies, which are direct descendants of the gulag system. China has long promoted family planning, beginning with the arrival of the communist government in 1949. Even so, the Chinese population crept toward 1 billion by the late 1970s. So the dictatorship decided to level up, and in 1980 they established the one-child policy, With the exception of some ethnic minorities and couples whose firstborn had a disability, Chinese couples were limited to a single child. Authorities offered carrots first and sticks afterward. Free contraceptives and financial incentives for those who obeyed, and economic or social punishments for the rebelliously fertile. In the worst cases, women were subjected to forced sterilization or abortion to enforce the ban.
I couldn't keep it, she replies. You either go willingly or the government comes for you.
This policy didn't bother to factor in the Chinese patriarchy, which continued to thrive under communist rule. If they were limited to one kid, many couples wanted it to be a son, to the point where unwanted daughters were aborted, killed, and abandoned. The male-to-female ratio remains skewed in China even today.
There are currently around 34 million more males than females in China. That is a lot.
There's another massive problem. If you don't produce enough people to replace your workforce, you end up with a bunch of old people and not enough young people to do the actual jobs. In other words, China's in a lot of trouble. As for the one-child policy, as of 2015, Chinese families were allowed 2 children, and as of 2021, it expanded to 3. In 1974, when the Emperor of Ethiopia and his government were overthrown by the Derg, a Marxist militia, some hoped that the authoritarian rule of the deposed monarch would be replaced by something better. They were quickly proved wrong. The Derg, hoping to cement its hold on the country, instituted a campaign of violence and repression equal to or worse than those of fellow European and Asian communist regimes. Ethiopia's Red Terror lasted from 1976 to 1978, again with that red word, and resulted in tens of thousands of deaths, although exact figures are murky. The transfer of leadership began as a power struggle between competing Marxist groups, but snowballed into something much more sinister after Mengistu Haile Mariam took power in 1976. Mengistu deputized militias and neighborhood groups to kill members of the rival faction and any other potential enemies of the Derg they might come across. The pogrom started in Addis Ababa and spread to Ethiopian cities, with the bodies of those killed left in the street. As a result, anyone claiming a body or even checking its identity was likely to become a victim as well. The violence lessened in 1978, but Mengistu remained in power until he was overthrown in 1991. He was convicted of genocide in 2007 by an Ethiopian court and sentenced to death. He was still living in exile in Zimbabwe at the age of 88. There was a time when Venezuela was among the most prosperous countries in the world. Today, not so much. In late 2024, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro declared himself the winner of the country's election, a reality that had little to do with votes and everything to do with his desire to stay president. To be fair, he did actually win his first election in 2013, running as a designated successor of cancer-stricken Hugo Chavez. But that was the last time Maduro played fair. Under Maduro, the economy of once wealthy Venezuela has collapsed to a degree numbers fail to capture. Inflation peaked at 9,500% in 2019, and the monthly minimum wage is now about $3, a mere fraction of its former purchasing power. In reaction to this hollowed-out economy and the regime's other assorted cruelties, including the abduction, imprisonment, and torture of real and imagined opponents, Venezuelans have voted the only way they effectively can: with their feet. Between 7 and 8 million Venezuelans have left the country during Maduro's tenure. To provide perspective, in 2022, the population hovered around 30 million, meaning that somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of Venezuelans have chosen migration and exile over more Madurismo.